Hey everybody, welcome to Geekshow Podcast Tabletop, or GSPC Tabletop. It's our inaugural show, so you'll have to forgive me a little bit of choppiness. We did try to record a live show here at Salt Lake Comic Con, and let's just say that video sleeps with the fishes. And it was a lot of fun to hang out with about 150 people and to talk about miniature painting. One of the biggest questions that comes up, though, when I'm doing paint sessions is paint. I mean, what is it? How does it work? What does it do? Why would we want to invest a whole bunch of money in expensive paints when there's so much stuff from like Apple Barrel or Ceram Coat out there that you can get for so much less? Anyway, let's dive into that a little bit, shall we? So when you're painting a fine, detailed miniature, one of the most important things you need to take into consideration is the quality of your paint. You have figures like this. Let's get this guy into detail, into focus. There's a lot of detail in this figure. He's not done by any means. He's nowhere near done, but as you can see, there's a lot of little folds, loops in the fabric, sections of the gourd on his pumpkin head, bits of bone on his skull. You really want to be able to pick those details out. That's not something you're going to be able to do with cheap, inexpensive paint. So what are the best types of paint out there? I always talk about avoiding your inexpensive paints like Apple Barrel or Ceram Coat. Yeah, you might spend 85, 65 cents, $1.25 on them. But what you're dealing with is a lot of cheap acrylic medium and really coarsely ground acrylic pigment that doesn't blend well together. So what ends up happening is you have really, really chalky paint that isn't going to do a great job for you. It's just going to look chalky. It's going to look fairly poor, and you're also going to end up using a lot more of that paint in the long run than you will if you use a more expensive, finer ground paint. So let's start with one of my favorites. Right here, this is a Vallejo game color. The reason why I'm showing you this one first is it's a primer. So instead of having to use a spray paint or a rattle can, you can actually just brush this Vallejo game color straight onto your miniature, and really works well for you if you're in a situation where you can't go outside. Say it's dead of winter, it's January, and you don't live in the tropics. So you can just brush this on. A couple of light coats will actually give you really good coverage on your figure. It's also really good if you just need to do touch up on a figure, like if some of the detail was damaged on one part of the figure but the rest of it's okay. You can actually do a good prime coat with this Vallejo game color. Really, really, really finely ground white pigment. I wouldn't recommend painting it as a white color, though. It's actually going to overwhelm anything that you've got underneath it. Another really good paint line. This is Formula P3. It's from Privateer Press, the people who make War Machine and Hordes. This has a really, really, really good suspension medium in it, and it doesn't separate. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit in more detail in a second. The pigment that's in this is really, really, really finely ground, and the suspension medium is really, really high quality. You don't see a lot of separation in it, so this little pot of paint that you can get into quite easily, it's convenient. You can actually brush right off of this top lip here. I like to take my brush and just brush right off of that for the paint that I'm going to be using. So really, really recommend this paint. It's nice. The paint colors are a little bit peculiar, though, because they formulated them specifically for War Machines and Hordes, so you don't have a lot of traditional colors. So if you're looking for a flat red, you're not really going to find it with Formula P3. You can find it. It's just not going to be as obvious with some other paints. I do think there's some deficiencies, though. Their blues, their greens, their browns are really good. I think their reds can be a little bit on the weak side, but red's kind of a tricky pigment to master. So let's move on to another decent color. This is game color from Vallejo. They do a couple of different game lines. Vallejo is pretty much from top to bottom, really high quality stuff. You'll probably pay anywhere from $3 to $4 for a 1 or 2 ounce bottle of this stuff. This uses a dropper top, so you want to give it a good shake when you first pick it up, and then you can just squeeze your paint out onto your palette. And that way you only really use a drop or two at a time. And I noticed that the squeeze bottles are actually really high quality, so you don't waste paint in the long run, which is great. Another paint brand that's getting a lot of movement right now is the Army Painter War Paints. I have a hard time with these paints. The pigment does separate from the suspension medium really easily. Like, I'm constantly shaking these paints up. On the other hand, it is a breathtakingly good line of paints as far as color range. there's probably 7 or 8 different shades of yellow, and they're all kind of graduated together. So you could go from the darkest yellow to the lightest color yellow in the Army Painter range and really have some startling highlights that you can work into it. So if you have the patience to shake these things, you're going to be shaking these little puddles of paint constantly to keep the pigment mixed in with the medium. They also tend to be a little less expensive than your typical paint lines. So I've noticed that Games Workshop paints are in the mid $3 range all the way up to $4. Army Painter paints, if your local gaming store is carrying them, I know you can pick them up for somewhere in the mid $2 range. So that's not a bad way to go. As far as washes are concerned, there's a couple that I do recommend. I'm going to recommend Army Painter, even though I'm not necessarily completely sold on their paints. I am sold on their washes. So this is the ink, Army Painter inks. They do the soft tone ink and a hard tone ink. Those are kind of your browns. You can go for some really startling or really muted ink washes with those. So that works out really quite nicely. They also do colored inks. So this is their green tone. If you paint orcs, I'm telling you, this is the ink for you, because if you go with a dark green and graduate your glaze scale all the way up to like a light yellow for highlights, and then you go over this with a really light green tone ink wash from Army Painter, your orcs are going to look so freaking cool. It's really great stuff. So highly recommended on the Army Painter quick shades. They're fantastic. You can get an introductory box of these. Probably less than $20, but don't take my word for that. Check your local gaming store, because they'll either be able to order it for you or tell you where you can get it. Another really good shade, Games Workshop Citadel Paints. They do this Nuln Oil shade, and their shade lines, in the past, I haven't really been a big fan of their washes or their inks. They tended to be kind of overpowering. There's an old skin ink that would completely flood out whatever color skin you put in underneath it. So it was just overpowering, overbearing. It was like painting with a hammer, and you just don't want to do that. This Nuln Oil I will use, straight out of the pot. It's a bigger pot. It's quite a bit bigger. If you look at it next to the Privateer press, there's quite a bit more paint in there. As a wash, Nuln Oil looks fantastic on machinery, on leather, on any of your darker colors, furs, on animals. It's hard to describe the color of it. It's kind of an oily, blackish, brownish blue, but it works great as a wash on all of your dark colors. And if Nuln Oil isn't cutting it for you, they do have some really good other washes. So this is Agrex Earth Shade. If you're doing any of your brown colors, it's really good for that. And then probably my favorite of the flesh washes here, the Reichland Flesh Shade, Flesh Shade. Thank you, Lee. Enunciation is difficult. The Reichland Flesh Shade is really, really good for your Caucasian flesh tones. I wouldn't recommend it for darker skin, but that's another class. We'll talk about that at another time. There's a couple other things you can do too to thin out your paints. In the past, I used Future Floor Polish. You can use any acrylic-based floor polish to actually dilute your paint instead of watering it down with water, because that's not going to be a good result for you. Whereas using something like Acrylic Medium, this is just straight acrylic medium. You mix your paint or your shade with this, and what you've done is basically suspended your pigment in more of the medium. So instead of watering it down and making it so that it's diluted, it's more suspended. And I'll explain that in a little more detail here in just a second. Also from Vallejo, there's a glaze medium here that you can use. This is thick. This isn't really watery. Like the Lamian medium is fairly really quite fluid. And it's really good for making a glaze if you're going to be doing a lot of highlights, or even if you're building a wash. Whereas this glaze medium from Vallejo, this stuff's thick. It sets out pretty quickly, but I did notice that it does lead to a really nice effect for suspending your pigments for your paints later on. So let's talk about why you want to actually go with an acrylic medium instead of water. Your water molecules are round. They're completely round, right? So if you're mixing water, which has a round molecular structure, with your pigment, which is actually flat, what ends up happening is your flat molecular structure of your pigment is basically going to roll over the sides of your round water molecules. So what ends up happening is you paint a wash that you've diluted with water over, say, like a face. It's going to look all right. It's going to go down into the recesses like it's supposed to, and you're going to get those really nice shadows that you're looking for. But you're going to notice as it dries and the water evaporates, you've got this flat pigment that's kind of just laying there dull and somewhat lifeless. But if you use an acrylic medium, whether it's this lamine medium or like a glaze or floor polish, it also has this flat molecular structure. So they bond together. So instead of sliding around on these round molecules here, they bond together and make a really, really nice glaze. And so the darker parts will actually go into the recesses like they're supposed to, and you have this really, really nice, sharp-looking figure later on. Of course, you might have to go through and do some highlights, but we'll talk about that on another session. So as always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section. I'll be definitely sure to respond to them. And if you need any tips, definitely happy to help with those too. Big thanks to our sponsor, Shiv Games, where you can get 15 to 30% off of any War Game supplies. And thanks again for tuning in to GSPC Tabletop.